So up first we have Des Kelly, who will be telling us about James Carey's cultural views as ecological equipment for living. Okay.
I'm the old wineskin on this channel, I think. And I'm totally nervous about this 15-minute thing because the notes that I had taken were on my iPad, which I lost yesterday. So I had to find an email with an earlier draft, a primitive version of it that was much more extensive, and I ended up bringing in a whole bunch of other stuff that resulted in something that's way too long. So what I have in mind is, rather than covering 3 of the points that I wanted to cover, I'm going to cover 2 and leave some room for conversation afterwards if that arises. So when people look to James W. Carey as the media ecologist, pioneer, if not canonical figure, we tend to default to his ritual transmission view of communication, and that's what most of us, I think, take away from his extensive work. But I had the occasion at one of the NCA conferences of meeting up with somebody who was supposed to have been the respondent to a paper I was presenting, and because there were different satellite campuses, the taxi took me to a wrong satellite campus, so I ended up missing the panel that I was supposed to present on that Quentin Schultz was going to be responding to. But he actually asked to meet me in person to give the feedback, and I was a little scared about that. I thought, well, it's so urgent that he has to, can he just email it to me? But it ended up being a beautiful conversation because we talked about what I was working on that I was presenting on, and he talked about what he was working on. And James Carey was sort of the connective tissue between those 2 works. And as it turns out, Quentin had been a doctoral student of his, so he had first-hand experience about Carey. And one of the things I didn't know, despite his Catholic analogies and some of his work, sort of parenthetical, was that he was a devout Catholic. He attended daily Mass, for example. So that it was intriguing to me because it told me that faith on some level was an integral part of his daily life. So it gave rise to a couple of questions. One was the same question that people ask about McLuhan and Ong and others who about whom their faith is not a secret, but not explicit or salient in the writing. And that was, to what extent might his Catholic sensibilities influence his writing? And the other one was, how might that be reflected in his assessment of the Media Ecology Association as a culture? He had written about journalism as a culture and about the academic, the academy as a culture. So I thought, could we take some of the themes for which he's well known and with a Catholic lens, if you would, could we describe the state of the culture of the Media Ecology Association? I intend this as sort of a fun exercise. I ended up getting serious about it as I started meditating and contemplating what is this thing, this Media Ecology Association. So these are some of my reflections, and I want to I want to kind of channel Carey in trying to assess how he look upon the Media Ecology Association as a culture, and to use the 3 categories that I think most obviously suggest themselves. The first one being ritual, the second the conversation, and the third is the public. And I think it's that last one I'm going to skip because I'm probably going to run out of time. I thought I had 45 minutes, but I was told I had only. I thought this was a keynote.
No, but you lost right back.
Next year.
But first I want to point out that Carey saw contemporary culture as in a state of disarray, and he saw that operating on a personal level as well. And his analysis of cultures are directed towards really the rough and tumble of that disarray. So he's not up there in the clouds. He's where the rubber meets the road, and it's because of that I think that we find some paradoxes in Carey's writing that I want to highlight because I think that they lead to a conclusion that even as we assess the Media Ecology Association as a culture, we can't say that ritualistically is there a check or not, that it is both. There's ambiguity and paradox in what might have been a Careyan analysis of the media ecology culture. So the first paradox I see is that although he was a proponent of liberal cultural studies, he was conservative in favoring order over chaos. He was a cultural pragmatist in the tradition of William James and John Dewey, not the ideological or fundamentalist sort, and was more open to the need for practical, everyday reason that would equip those within social institutions, yes, even institutions, to function wisely and well without lording it over other people. He opposed the Marxist interpretation of history that was dominant in journalism graduate schools, but less on ideological grounds than on the fact that, quote, it did not speak to Americans' sense of their own experience, and two, that it was exhausted. It had done its intellectual work and was just redundant. Secondly, he was one of the founders of culture studies, and yet objected to the rendition of cultural studies that's popular today, maybe dominant, that reduces to narrow socioeconomic categories or to categories of power and ideology. He was concerned instead with the cultural practice of meaning making. Much of Carey's work, as Schultz said, was warned about empires seeking to eliminate borderlands, reduce cultural diversity, and fashion society into their own hegemonic, often self-centered images. But he upheld cultural diversity not as an end unto itself, but as a means to healthy conversation that can prevent externally imposed monopolies of knowledge. And conversation, he said, suggests listening, learning, and interpreting, not just talking. In fact, although politically he clearly leaned left, he was flabbergasted by unfair partisan reporting and even castigated the way Democrats used television to stage a ritual of excommunication on Robert Bork in 1987. He argued that partisanship erodes democratic forces, both in its method as well as its results. For him, culture did not reduce to those categories of race, class, power, gender. Such political correctness is disconnected from the experience of the majority of citizens, historic and contemporary. And such foci become hegemonic themselves, he said, within the cultural studies, when the cultural studies scholar chooses to work within rather than across those fault lines. Thirdly, on the one hand, he was the ultimate professional, tirelessly serving a succession of departments, colleges, universities, as professor, dean, president of associations, performing the kind of drudgery that institutions alone know how to generate. But on the other hand, he was a vocal opponent of those who defined themselves as professionals, whose identity was circumscribed by the political and ideological interests of a professional constituency, and who failed to challenge that role. So I assumed that in channeling Carey to do a cultural assessment of the Media Ecology Association, that I should expect to find some kind of, as I said, ambiguity or even contradiction in scouting out the categories of analysis that he might propose. So the first one is ritual, and it's a major theme of his, of course. And in particular, he was more focused on the ceremonial, shared symbol making of that which builds community than that which transmits or seeks conversion. In his description of communication as ritualistic, he defines or identifies several key dimensions of communication and culture, including that it is participatory, intersubjective, communal, time-bound, and preservational. And we see some of those elements in just this one little excerpt. In a ritual definition, communication is linked to terms such as sharing, participation, association, fellowship, and the possession of a common faith. This definition exploits the ancient identity and common roots of the terms commonness, communion, community, and communication. A ritual whose communication is directed
not toward the extension of messages in space, but toward the maintenance of society in time. Not the act of imparting information, but the representation of shared beliefs. One sees the intersubjective thread in his thinking about these shared experiences. The experience of others in the light of our own, and our own in the light of others, he wrote. And of course, heavily influenced by Innis, Carey recognized that the transmission model of communication, whose paradigm is found in the telegraph, imposed an expansive space bias and worked to homogenize culture, and in doing so eclipsed the rituals that were locally produced and passed on through time, intergenerationally, and within traditional social institutions, including faith communities. The process of cultural meaning-making, he said, runs not only fast forward, but in reverse as well. He said ritual gives coherence, structure, and meaning to an otherwise chaotic world. As such, he said that the ritualistic communication that fashions meaning out of chaos amounts to a participation in a new genesis. A ritualistic view of communication is also oral-based, requiring personal interaction. Consistent with Innis's view, it cannot be monopolized. I didn't have to think much about how this might apply to the Ecology Association. I thought just about a recent exchange on the listserv about the early NYU University conferences that were recounted with some detail. The names of hotels, the location of the cities, the reference to mock performances, mock defenses, something like that. The celebrities, if you would, that were there. And I think the recounting of that, the commemoration of that, performed a ritualistic function in that it underscored something there, though not explicitly articulated, some of the value that was at least in the genesis of the association. The one counterpart to that I wondered was that the ones who were recounting that were a part of an inner circle of people, first of all, who were there, and that rendered other people who were reading this for the first time eavesdroppers in a way. But then on the other hand, I wondered if Carey might think did that little exchange function as a cool medium, prompting people like me to ask, are there other ritualistic functions occurring today? Is that repeated in some way? And I did think of the presidential address at the awards banquet. I do think that it performs a kind of homiletics function in that it underscores, affirms certain values, orientations, epistemologies that I think perform a cultural function. Then the conversation is the second and last category I'll treat. It's obviously a major theme of Carey. And his son wrote in that special issue of EME that his focus on conversation may have been influenced by his upbringing. He was born and raised in the neighborhood of North Providence, known as Manton. It was really an urban village with an ethnic mix largely tilted toward the Irish and Catholic. He was diagnosed with a heart murmur at a young age and kept out of school, and the only treatment then provided until the 10th grade. So he spent his time circulating around the neighborhood, talking to retired people, those who couldn't work, people who ran businesses, the local priests, anyone who was around. And as Adam wrote in the foreword to Carey's famous book, in Carey's world, life is a conversation. The paradigm of a ritualistic view of communication is the conversation. Even in journalism, he wrote, journalism ought to be conceived less on the model of information and more on the model of conversation. A key facet of conversation that Carey noted is that it was quotidian, pragmatic, relational. His view of culture, including technoculture, stresses communication as relational, as the life energy holding together diverse symbolic and material organisms. He had little regard for the broad, objective philosophies or principles, but was more anchored in historically located human experience. He saw it also as egalitarian. He was concerned with any excessive self-righteousness or fundamentalism, whether emanating from religious standpoints or secular ideology. And I think we could all agree that with a statement that he quotes from de Tocqueville, with a reference to the mini republics, M-I-N-I republics that he saw in America, I think, and that's a sign for Carey of a healthy culture.
And I think we would see that clearly in the Media Ecology Association in the various particular interests that people have. There are those who are interested in the general semantics, those interested in religious undercurrents, others gather around the notion of interorality or interrelationships and that kind of thing. So I think you would see that as a healthy sign, because people in those various little mini republics are also in the other circles. They interface a lot with all of them. And for him, that's a marker of a healthy conversation, a healthy culture. I want to skip down to this, though, the question that he would have in making the point that conversations are egalitarian. He does so on the basis that there's no hierarchy there. But as I assess the conversation in the Media Ecology Association, I find many of them, perhaps most of them, on the one hand to be so wholesome and fulsome and rich and authentic and true and spontaneous, and they happen not just in these more formal settings, but at the walk to dinner and through email exchanges and all of that. Am I out of time?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
Cool.
I'm not going to yank you off the stage.
That's very but the one question I have is that, my question, I've observed that occasionally when some people, including maybe especially those people who have the gravitas to be opining on certain issues or responding to certain comments, when they do so, that sometimes it comes off more as monologue than dialogue, and I think it can have the effect of creating an inner and an outer circle. And while we need the mother in the Greek fact Greek mother film, who is the protector of the cultural values, sort of the junkyard dog who fends off ideas that would be hostile to the culture. I find some of that off-putting, and I find it deleterious to the life function, the conversational life function of the culture. So it's an area that I think that Carrie might also find a little bit unhealthy. And I'd invite you, if we have time, the third function is public. I'd be interested in hearing what you think he would, how he might assess the Media Ecology Association as the public dimension of the Media Ecology Association. I have some ideas, but I'd be interested in yours in the spirit of conversation. Thank you.
Next up, we have Eric Jenkins. He's going to give us Lewis Mumford from Media Ecology and Machinic Ecology.
Thank you, Brett. So this presentation is kind of a thought experiment. Basically one that asks the question, what would have happened, or what would happen if Mumford and not McLuhan became the famous intellectual or the figurehead of media studies as we know it. Mumford himself sounds a little bit bitter that McLuhan was the one that became famous. He says in his book, McLuhan's Global Village is a humbug, and goes on to offer an extensive critique of McLuhan's thinking. But they do share a lot in common, a focus on technics, the argument that technology shapes human culture and subjectivity, especially an ecological focus, as we know. As Mumford even says, all thinking worthy of the name now must be ecological. But in some ways, Mumford's critique of McLuhan says that McLuhan is not ecological enough, that his focus on media is too narrow of a focus. And so kind of the answer to this thought experiment, I believe, is that the term media would not be central, but instead this might be the machinic ecology association. And that indeed, I believe a machinic ecology field does have some benefits, at least as a supplement to a media ecology field. And I'm going to talk about two of those benefits today. One, that it would produce a better and more critical analysis of power and politics. And second, that it enables a better psychological analysis of techniques and technology. Now, I know that the machine, that concept seems so outdated from one perspective. The machine seems like a kind of the linear mass production things like the printing press or the assembly line that seem to be disappearing, first as McLuhan proclaimed in the electronic era, and today, especially in the digital era, as some people like Henry Jenkins might maintain. But this is part of Mumford's critique of McLuhan, that the machine is not ending, but instead expanding. As Mumford says, as McLuhan sees it, machines themselves will vanish, and he's wrong about that. Unfortunately, his ideas have been widely accepted because they magnify the mega machine while seeming to revolt against it. In actuality, for Mumford, the electronic media are just another expansion of the mega machine's power over time and space, and therefore an enhancement of control. And he draws this conclusion, as I mentioned earlier, because he sees media as only a small part in a larger ecology, and that this larger ecology is fundamentally shaped by what he calls mega machines. Now, mega machines, it starts off in Mumford's work on the city, and he traces the mega machine to ancient Egypt as the first kind of iteration of this machine. And he calls it a machine in a very literal sense. He says that this is a machine in the orthodox definition of the term. He says it's not a mere administrative organization. It is a machine in the orthodox technical sense as a combination of resistant bodies so organized as to perform standardized motions and repetitive work. You might think that the mega machine is kind of a model for bureaucracies or militaries, where it's a means of bringing many people together, dividing up the labor, combining those resistant bodies in order to perform certain standardized motions or certain work. Now, the ancient mega machine, its goal was largely to produce pyramids and other grave sites for the Egyptian pharaohs. The modern mega machines are all about producing commodities and profit. But all of these mega machines have their own unique power source. They're aimed at producing something. They conquer property in order to engage in that production. The goal is profit or power of some kind. And they use publicity as a means to control those resistant parts, i.e. the human parts of these mega machines. And if, with this concept of mega machines, I think you can see how media only play a role in these mega machines. That they're not the entirety. They don't form the entire ecology. So in a bureaucracy, there are certain written media or electronic media that are used to pass orders down the line to coordinate the activities of the bureaucracy, but that media is only one part of that larger mega machine. So one of the big differences for Mumford between the ancient mega machines and the modern mega machines is that they have different parts. That there's automated parts in the modern mega machine, and that there's also media that enable the spread of the transmission of orders down the line over a longer scale, or over more space and over more time. But for Mumford, the machine itself is much larger than these media. In fact, the media are shaped by this machine. So if for human beings we could say the medium is the message, then for media themselves, the machine is the message. That is, that the media is how the effects of media will be determined by the social machine or the mega machine into which they are inserted. And this kind of machinic analysis leads to an understanding of the quality of the machine, which shapes the qualities of our life. Mumford mentions that the characteristics of the machine are to aim farther away, to aim for more, to aim for bigger, and to aim for faster. That the main purpose of the mega machine is to create more power, bigger power, power that can reach further, power that can gather more. He says, on these assumptions, the object of human life is to remove limits, to hasten the pace of change, to smooth out seasonal rhythms and reduce regional contrasts, in fine, to promote mechanical novelty and destroy organic continuity. I think you can see in that quotation one of the first benefits I see to a machinic analysis as opposed to immediate analysis is this ability to examine power and be critical of the political and power in our society. And it's pretty well known that McLuhan was either neutral on these issues or in some ways celebratory of electronic media's prospects. You know, in hindsight, kind of looking back from today, that celebratory angle in McLuhan seems a little silly, at least to me. You know, the problems that we face today seem to have only enhanced since that time, not gotten better. And I feel like in media ecology too often this is the case, that their analyses don't tend to end with the socio-political consequences in relation to power. And, you know, for instance, Lance did quite an amazing lecture a couple of conferences ago, the A before E lecture, y'all remember that one? Which I thought was quite an amazing kind of diagram of these transformations based on media. And I asked him the question afterwards, you know, one thing that seems missing in this diagram is power, you know, this thing that critical theory has been like really focused on since, you know, at least Foucault came around. And you know, I was kind of shocked that Lance didn't really have an answer to that. He kind of stumbled and fumbled in response to my question. And I think that's you know, to each their own how they want to do analysis. But I think that is a blind spot of a lot of media ecology, at least in the McLuhan tradition. So, you know, for Mumford, the mega machine, that's not the case at all. The mega machine is producing environmental desiccation. He says it's alienating humans from work, eroding creativity and intelligence, producing totalitarian government under whatever banner it might fly its flag. You know, one of the benefits, I think, to this mega machinic analysis is Mumford only mentions briefly, but today would, I think, has even more import, where he says, these debates about capitalism versus communism, big government versus small government, individual responsibility versus the collective, are all kind of missing the point, right? That all of those different organizations of society rely on the same mega machinic template, and they all tend to produce totalitarian governments and machinic enslavement because of that template. He says, both mega machines are oriented towards death. And the more they approach unified planetary control, the more inescapable does that result promise to become. He says with nuclear weapons, the mega machine has produced a permanent state of war. And the main thrust of his criticism, at least at the media level, is that a rich polytechnical culture that we inherited through the Middle Ages has been replaced by a monotechnical culture and monocultures themselves. And then a second benefit I see in this machinic analysis is producing a better psychological analysis of technics. You know, I think McLuhan and media ecology in general often has this borderline with psychology, especially since we're concerned with the ways that media is shaping human subjectivity. You know, the talk of literate man, of different sensory ratios, obviously the narcissist narcosis, the idea of overheating and reversals. All have their psychological dimensions. And I think McLuhan shares with Mumford the idea that technology is indeed constitutive of subjectivity. But there's this interesting thread in Mumford, similar, I think, to Baudrillard, that says that where he does a psychological analysis of the technology rather than the person, where he kind of sees the person and their psychological profile as the outcome of certain machines instead of vice versa. Just a couple of examples of that. He says, the system itself is fixed and inflexible, so much so that it is little more than a neat mechanical model of a compulsion neurosis, and perhaps even springs from the same ultimate source, anxiety and insecurity. He also said, the basic conditions for mental stability, accepted criteria of values, accepted norms of conduct, recognizable faces, buildings, landmarks, recurrent vocational duties, and rituals are constantly being undermined, and as a result of our whole power-driven civilization is turning into a blank page, torn to shreds from within by psychotic violence. He describes Hitler and Eichmann as the result of mega machines, not as the leaders of those mega machines or the creators of those mega machines, but as the natural outcome of mega machines. He says, for delusions of grandeur and fantasies of absolute power are an essential motive power for this peculiar mechanism, referring to the mega machine. He says, and I think you know, a psychological analysis of a machinic ecology would be different from one based in a media ecology. You know, in media ecology, many theorists might see an increase with the digital revolution in freedom, participation, a decreased passivity on the part of the consumer, more community due to social media and the ability to share and create new publics. And I think that's true from this perspective of a media user ecology, the relationship between the media and the user. The user has been empowered in some ways. But from a machinic perspective, this freedom is indeed a device for control and exploitation more than it is true freedom. Right? That what's happening is they allow us, as Peter and I discussed in our paper on Mega Machine on Facebook as a Mega Machine yesterday, that they give us certain levels of freedom because then our choices are tracked and targeted and channeled in ways that enhance the power of major corporations. And today I think we can see that we have indeed from this digital media not freedom but more of a monotechnics. A monotechnics of the click is what I'm calling it, the mouse click, right? That everything, all of our techniques rotate and revolve around the clicking. And a monoculture as well, where the one product that's produced in our media culture is attention. The one product that's fought over, as Richard Lanham describes in his book, Economics of Attention. You know, and that shapes our culture when everyone is aimed at producing attention. Then we tend to get the more spectacular, the more extreme, etc. And I think some of the negatives to a monoculture that Mumford is talking about are certainly evident today. And I think also this analysis, psychological analysis, helps us point to alternatives. The necessity to have time and space for creativity, the necessity for polytechnics, the necessity for diversity, and abundance, as he says, rather than just quantitative massification under the mega machine. So I think today it's urgent that we continue Mumford's legacy, especially this machinic ecological analysis, especially because the differences that the digital is introducing into the mega machine. Mumford talks about in the modern mega machine there's a suppression of personality. As I mentioned in the digital mega machines, the exact opposite. We're encouraged to express ourselves, tell us how we feel and why we are all unique individual snowflakes. Mumford said in the modern mega machines, that there was this thing he called the megatechnic bribe, where we were given a little bit of the taste of consumer lifestyle in exchange for being exploited on the factory line and etc. And I think today that megatechnic bribe is different. It's what Peter and I are calling the digital bribe, where we're given these sort of free services in exchange for allowing our privacy and our data to be mined. And one of the big emphasis of his critique of the modern mega machine is the standardization and secrecy. And today, I think, again, the digital mega machine, that doesn't quite apply. There's not standardization, but instead this emphasis on diversification. There's not secrecy, but instead this flood of information. And power often uses that flood as a way to hide its operations in plain sight. So it's very urgent today, I think, to do an analysis and update of his notion of the modern mega machine and talking about the way digital media are transforming that mega machine. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aaron. Next up, we have Peter Fallon with Harold Adams Innis and Global War on Terror.
Well, Dennis feels a little bit like the old wineskin. I'm feeling a little bit like the old wine right now. And I have a wonderful story about how this set of papers got here. And I'm not going to bore you with it, but I'm thankful that I have a dog sitter with a master's in library sciences who could navigate the Byzantine file structure that I save things in and got it to me. So in this presentation, I want not only to briefly summarize Innis's theories, if there's anyone in the room who's not familiar with Innis, but also to focus on both the explicit and implicit values upon which his work is based, and to apply his theories to 21st century problems, specifically global income inequality and terrorism. A thesis that I want to develop is that the current strife we are witnessing in the world, variously called the global war on terror, or the war between good and evil, or just jihad, is actually a war between time-biased and space-biased cultures. Now, Innis asked, why do we attend to the things to which we attend? And I think that is the fundamental question behind all of his work. While all cultures share some deep structural similarities, not all cultures express or actualize those similarities in the same way. Cultural differences may be just that, cultural. But there may be other factors that explain why, for instance, one culture has clung for generations or even centuries to an economy based on subsistence, while another has developed a surplus economy, trade, and eventually global trade. It was communication, Innis told us, and the media of communication that were the decisive factors. So to begin really briefly with the basics, time-biased and space-biased media. We know that time-biased media are those that store information better, longer, more reliably than they transmit. And space-biased media are those that transmit information faster, more efficiently than they store it. The earliest time-biased media that Innis refers to are heavy, durable, not easily transported, and therefore likely to be stationary and lasting. The archetypal space-biased medium is the one that is light and easily transportable, but has a fragile, ephemeral quality. Stone is a time-biased medium, papyrus a space-biased medium. But if we leave things there, it doesn't appear that there's a lot of utility to this. And I think this is one of the reasons why I believe Innis is as overlooked as he is. So we need to, I think, infer a couple of principles from his work that I believe are there, but may not be explicitly spelled out. One is that the bias of a medium toward either time or space is relative. Since even heavy, durable media can, to some extent, be transported, and even a fragile, ephemeral medium, like a piece of papyrus, can store information, as museums around the world show us. A second one is that the relative bias of each medium should be judged in relation to the other media currently in use in a culture. In 1452, the printed book was a medium of profound space bias in relationship to the manuscript. In 2012, it's much more time-biased medium than the dominant electronic and digital counterparts. And there are two more principles that we need to infer from Innis's work. The third is a culture dominated by a medium of a particular bias takes on the characteristics of that bias. In other words, we need to think about space-biased cultures and time-biased cultures. And finally, each culture, according to its bias, holds a particular conception of what precisely information is and is not. And so we need to think about categories of time-biased information and space-biased information. If, as Neil Postman pointed out, media are epistemologies, sorting, culling, and delivering knowledge to us according to their specific biases, then I think Innis is telling us that media also impose an ontology upon us via our culture, focusing our attentions on those pieces of information that relate specifically to whatever our conception of reality might be. Time-biased cultures tend to, and again, I'm talking about those cultures primarily dependent on time-biased media, tend to put a great deal of emphasis on information that is eternal and unchanging and absolute and true. This is only natural because you would not dedicate to stone, for example, a piece of information that will be outdated and useless tomorrow. Space-biased cultures tend to focus attention on information that is more dynamic and changing. Such a culture has at its disposal a medium that allows them to administer large-scale organizations across wide areas. So space-biased cultures tend to be more dynamic and constantly changing than time-biased cultures. Time-biased cultures, by contrast, are more traditional and conservative. Okay. Time-biased cultures put their stock in myth, tradition, and folklore, in concerns of religion or spirituality, in pursuits that touch upon the questions of time, not just human time, but eternal time, cosmic time, if you will, the afterlife. They are generally politically decentralized, time-biased cultures, and unstable. I'm sorry. And unstable, but culturally, politically unstable, but culturally quite cohesive. Such information or thought structures encourage a social structure wherein we will find among the strongest of the social institutions that of religion and or some sort of priesthood. Poetry and the bards, folklorists, who keep traditions alive and spread them through time. Historians, musicians, and artists. They extend themselves through cyclical time and consider themselves, their cultures, and their values a permanent part of an unchanging universe. Space-biased cultures, by contrast, emphasize, engender, support, and are dominated by organized institutions that build upon the utility of space-biased media, government, commerce, and military. All institutions intimately concerned with space and the organization of space. I wish we had water here, I'm telling you right now. These cultures are generally highly politically and economically centralized, though potentially culturally impoverished. Space-biased media gives such cultures the impetus and wherewithal to create empire and constant change. In each case, a space-biased culture or a time-biased one, social institutions accrete around a dominant medium and a certain rigidity sets in. Innis refers to these as monopolies of knowledge. Organized force is closely associated with these monopolies of knowledge. The functional elite in an environment of monopolized knowledge wield enormous power, defining ontologically what is and is not knowledge. The organized force associated with monopolies of knowledge can take any number of forms depending on the culture type we're looking at. Police, military, or peer groups controlling behavior, a priesthood or monarchy controlling information, a religious or secular or government-controlled education system controlling thought, etc. Organized force results in a degree of homogeneity of thought and behavior, of consensus views of reality, of stasis. The optimal condition of any culture is balance, Innis tells us, the absence of monopolies of knowledge, based on either time or space. Because human beings are both material and immaterial, spiritual. Or at the very least, humans experience different sorts of realities, both sensory and material, and imaginative and transcendent. But balance is generally short-lived and rare. All new media imply moments of entropic influence. Monopolies of knowledge are undermined and frequently destroyed. During those moments of collapse and change, as monopolies of knowledge shatter and organized forces weaken, cultures may blossom, or there may be violent upheaval. So here we go to the war on terror. And there is one more argument that I'd like to make, which we really should pay attention to, and that is that Innis tells us that cultural reform happens slowly in either a time-biased or space-biased culture. In a time-biased culture, it's because you're dealing with what is perceived as absolute universal truth. And in a space-biased culture, because information media are reluctant to criticize the economic system, since the complexity of technology makes the various media an integral part of the economy. So, in the beginning, as it were, oral cultures reigned. 5? Okay, I'll talk really, really fast. Oral cultures were, by their nature, time-biased cultures. In an oral culture, learning is memorized or recited, a fact that puts significant limitations on the amount and type of information any individual can learn, retain, and use. With the development of writing, we might expect to see a rapid shift to a bias towards space, but we don't, not immediately at least. first thing oral cultures did when assimilating the new medium of writing was to record for all time the absolute, eternal, and true stories that they had been telling for countless generations. The monopoly of knowledge based on the spoken word was strong enough that, initially at least, the impact of writing is to reinforce the priestly monopoly of knowledge that had been previously based on oral lore. One of the things we need to point out is that literacy is not a panacea or a cure-all, and in fact, it has an Achilles heel, and that Achilles heel is fundamentalism. I'm going to jump ahead of you because I probably have like 2 minutes left. In the philosophic tradition that arose in Greece, best exemplified by Plato, the Academy, and its most prolific student, Aristotle. Textual religions of the axial age, this age during which literacy arose and the oral traditions were written down, are a vestige, really, of the monopoly of knowledge based on sacred stories. There's going to be a conflict in the future between these two written traditions, the one that seeks new knowledge and the one that wishes to preserve the old knowledge. In the early centuries of the Christian era, even before the coming of Muhammad and the rise of Islam, Aristotle, his influence had been felt widely in the East, in Asia Minor, Egypt, and North Africa, and the Arab lands. As early as the 6th century, Syrian Christians translated the works of Plato, Aristotle, and other Greek philosophers into Arabic. In Persia, Aristotle and Porphyry were translated into Persian. And during this period, Muslims found and developed a faith within an oral tradition, an oral tribal environment that traditionally emphasized group over individual identity. I thought this was much quicker than it's turning out to be. I'll try to just summarize in the last, what, minute, 2 minutes?
3, actually.
3? I'm going to keep reading that.
Me too.
Okay. I think that Innis provides us with a tool that we're generally not that aware of, that we can really look at quite contemporary problems beyond hot and cold, and see that we really do have within us these choices to make on what sorts of realities we choose to construct for ourselves. Now, under the influence of mass communication, it's very, very difficult sometimes to choose any but the consensus reality. Well, thanks. It's a little late, but thank you very much.
Somebody else even wonder?
No.
Oh.
To choose anything but the consensus of reality. If I had finished this, some of you may have felt that it was a defense of radical Islam. It's not. Because, as I say, this fundamentalism of whatever form it takes, and in fact we could use Innis to look at our own political system within the United States and the rise of the powerful right that we see in front of us right now. So that's it. Innis is cool.
Thank you, Peter.
And now it's Brett.
And now it's me. I'll be bringing it on home with Erving Goffman, interpersonal communication and media ecology. So like many of you, I am an accidental media ecologist. Before I even knew the Media Ecology Association existed, I read Ong, Havelock, Goody, Lowell with Ann Pym, now MacDonald, for those of you who know her, Benjamin Lee Whorf, Edward Sapir in linguistics, Paul Waslavic, Ellison Jackson, and Erving Goffman in interpersonal communication. So I give you this kind of bibliography biography as a way of kind of showing that, first of all, not all roads lead straight to media ecology, and that these scholars that we've adopted into our pantheon were someone else's before we stole them, and I'm okay with stealing them because, frankly, we're taking them and enjoying it. I'm all right with that. So my contention here, as I thought through this panel, was to think through what are these scholars in their own right, as opposed to thinking of them as media ecologists. I decided to think of Goffman not as a media ecologist, but as a sociologist of communication. And Goffman is, in some ways, kind of an odd duck in our pantheon. He's not like really heavy media, centric, like say McLuhan or Postman. And in some ways, he does do some of that with frame analysis and his gender advertisements book. But I suggest that his focus is mostly on the experience of the individual rather than on the structure or content of the surrounding media environment. And so rather than seeing this as a limitation, I suggest that this focus on communication and identity can give us, as media ecologists, significant insight. So I'd like to touch on 3 areas that Goffman's work illustrates. Humans are media, would be my first one. Communication is always one-to-one, and I know that's going to be contentious, so we'll have some fun with that. And that we are all part of the same system. So let's get right into it. So, first of all, humans are media in themselves. This is a view that's been echoed lately by Wayne Constantino and Eric McLuhan, for example. And we just saw yesterday a little kind of round table. Someone had a book called Human as Media. Awesome. Yeah, we're still banging that drum. So for Goffman, communication can be both intentional and unintentional. He said there is the expression that one gives and the expression that one gives off. Our bodies are constantly broadcasting messages, whether we want to or not, and then these are decoded by others. And they're not decoded in a vacuum. As Goffman suggests, everyone will possess some knowledge of the same vocabulary of body symbols. Indeed, the understanding of a common body idiom is one reason for calling an aggregate of individuals a society. We know what this means. And these actions are defined in the culture in which we live. And we'll get into that later on in this paper. So our bodies are an intrinsic part of the physical reaction and interaction. So as scholars of nonverbal and computer-mediated communication can attest, once we strip out the body from the message, we remove a lot of cues that we're expected to pick up on, such as tone, prosody, gesture, posture, proximity, touch. So when we're deprived of this, we're forced to infer it by the information in the message itself, but it's clear that we're always projecting a persona, even in an online environment. Goffman argues that the human tendency to use signs and symbols means that evidence of social worth and of mutual evaluations will be conveyed by very minor things, and these things will be witnessed, as will the fact that they have been witnessed. An unguarded glance, a momentary change in tone, an ecological position taken or not taken can drench a talk with judgmental significance. And this is reminiscent by an axiom by Wisloff, Ellis, and Jackson: one cannot not communicate. And they conclude that others, in turn, cannot not respond to these communications and are thus themselves communicating. So for Goffman, we are continually performing an identity. He says what the person projects and defends and invests his feelings in is an idea about himself. And ideas are vulnerable not to facts and things, but to communication. So this, of course, is shaped by the media environment in which we live. As Lunceford explains, different media environments tend to favor or discourage different types of selves. And as the materials we work with change, our sense of self may also be altered. And I would contend that media can change and evolve over time, and the medium that is our body is no different. So, second point, communication is always one-to-one. So in an age of digital media, communication has become increasingly abstract, to the point where it's difficult to find the humanity in the messages. But Goffman reminds us that regardless of the media, there is a person who creates the message and there is a person who receives it. For Goffman, I would contend communication is always from person to person. You guys can attack me later, and that'll be fun. I'll wait to see what Dan has to say about this one. So in the case of an actual one-to-one speaking arrangement, Goffman explains there's a kind of dance that has to be performed amongst the participants. We are always performing for others, and ourselves, of course, and we are always audience members for others' performances. Everything we do, say, write, create is an expression of ourselves. And we, in turn, stand in judgment of others or deny or confirm their conception of self. So Goffman explains that whenever an individual does or however he appears, he knowingly and unknowingly makes information available concerning the attributes that might be imputed to him and hence the categories in which he might be placed. He expands this idea elsewhere when he says, in using the naked senses to receive embodied messages from others, the individual also makes himself available as a source of embodied information for them. Each giver is himself a recipient and a receiver. And a giver, sorry. In mediated displays, though, one is no longer constrained by who is actually in the audience. But still, he or she must consider who may actually see the performance once it is stored, codified, and offered up for mass consumption to those in his or her circle. Still, the question of performer always centers on who will witness the performance. Bernie Hogan, for example, suggests that in online interactions there is a distinction between material that is performed for the individual and material which is curated by a third party. You know, you love the fact that Facebook, you see someone's feed like 4 days after they posted it kind of deal? Yeah. But still, we have to be mindful of what entities could see it. And as Goffman reminds us, just as it is useful for the performer to exclude persons from the audience to see him in an inconsistent performance, so it is also useful for the performer to exclude from the audience those before whom he has performed in the show past a show inconsistent with the current one. One solution suggested by Hogan is that individuals define the lowest common denominator of what is normatively acceptable. Still, though, to consider this level, one must consider the individuals themselves in order to determine what would be appropriate to them. So I would contend that one is still attempting to communicate to another individual. Third, we are all part of the same system. We are all complicit in societal norms. As such, others have some degree of power over us and we over them. As Goffman explains in his discussion of face work, while one's social face can be his most personal possession and the center of security and pleasure, it is only on loan to him from society. It will be withdrawn unless he conducts himself in a way which he is worthy of. The way that individuals behave in a worthy manner is the extent to which they abide by the ritualistic imperatives embedded within their society. In short, do they play the game correctly? When one fails to act by the rules governing their interaction, others may respond swiftly and even violently. In today's global village, one can even run afoul of rules that are not those of his or her own society, as we've seen in the case of the murder of the cartoonist of Charlie Hebdo. As Goffman observes, every act of communication is a risk. All parties must perform this dance. One must speak appropriately, and one must react appropriately when spoken to. These rules not only govern communication, but ourselves, because communication, he says, is a way in which selves are confirmed. The norms of interaction are bound by both culture and occasion. As we adapt ourselves to these norms, we begin to fill specific roles and thereby become what these roles dictate. As Goffman states, for each role there is a self-image, and that self then virtually awaits the individual entering a position. He need only conform to the pressures on him, and he will find a me ready-made for it. In essence, we communicate ourselves into our shared existence. So in a review essay considering Goffman's work, Philip Strong notes, in neither its style nor its content does it fit the disciplinary norm, and many of the problems in its reception may be traced to its academic oddity. And I suppose that many of us here can sympathize with such an assessment, and perhaps that's what draws me to this work. Indeed, Goffman was a sociologist who provided incredible insights into the nature of communication. And performance scholars, for example, have long drawn on his work, whether they know it or not. I mean, like, you can pretty much condense Judith Butler down to Goffman and drag, which makes it all the more insulting that she doesn't cite him once in Gender Trouble, believe it or not. Talk about rip-off. But for our purposes, Goffman reminds us of the human element that can sometimes be overlooked as we examine ecologies of media. We are not outside of these systems, nor are we even merely a part of these systems. There's one system within these other systems in which our physical bodies are the entire set of components. And to me, this is an essential contribution to media ecology by way of Goffman. So we have a few minutes. Good. We got about 13 minutes to have questions, so let's get into it.